Today we have the chairman and co-founder of Lifecycle, Tim Johnson. Tim, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great to be speaking with you.
And thanks very much for coming. Tim, we wanted to start today, and our focus is on the energy transition. So our focus today is probably more on the electric vehicle batteries than on the consumer good batteries, but nonetheless, maybe you can describe Lifecycle's activities more generally, its industries, where it situates itself within these broader markets, whether it's energy transition or the broader consumer goods green economy.
Yeah, absolutely, Jonathan. So Lifecycle is today North America's largest recycler of lithium-ion batteries. We do process everything from consumer batteries all the way up through and including electric vehicle modules, electric vehicle battery packs, but also the manufacturing scrap that comes from these industries. It's important to note that by way of market segmentation is that the EV market and that battery scrap market that is being generated from the production of new materials for electric vehicles is the fastest growing sector across the full spectrum of lithium ion. And so what do? We work with customers, and these are typically OEMs, battery producers, and the like. We take that material in and we process it through our patented two-stage process. We call it the spoke and hub model. And we refer to that just simply because it follows both the processing, but then also the business model. We have two spoke facilities currently operational, one in Kingston, Ontario, one in Rochester, New York. We recently announced a third one in Arizona. These are all strategically located close to where batteries are being generated. As we continue to roll out our facilities around the world, the goal with our spoke facilities is to try and get that upfront processing as close as possible to the market. And we were talking about the EV market here. Well, that's really twofold. One, it is where people are. People drive cars, people drive electric vehicles. And so ultimately that's where those vehicles will end up dying and need recycling at the end of their life. But the other part of it is also close to where the battery manufacturers generate these materials in the first place. And for example, in the northeast of the US, that's quite prominent. We announced last week a deal with Ultium, which is the joint venture between LG and GM, where they're building a new facility to produce new battery materials in the northeast. But similar, we have other facilities that exist in the southwest, and going forward there'll be new Lifecycle facilities popping up as new battery manufacturing facilities establish themselves.
Yeah.
That's the front end part of it, of how we interact with the industry on the front end, but we'll keep going on, and I'll talk a little bit more about the back end later.
Yeah, and let me ask you, in terms of the recovery of those batteries at end of life, are we seeing yet in the marketplace a kind of a scramble for positioning around the sourcing, the long-term sourcing of those batteries? Has that come to pass yet, or is it foreseeable in the future?
It's mostly focused on the battery manufacturing scrap at the moment. So if you think about it, the recycling market is interesting when it comes to lithium-ion batteries. As this market grows in terms of, we keep talking about gigafactories being established, and the number continues to grow almost on a daily basis, is that all these facilities, as they're deployed, they generate scrap. Just like any manufacturing process, there's offcuts, there's things that don't meet quality control requirements. And so those materials need to go somewhere, and they end up in facilities like Lifecycle in order to process them back into materials to go back into that supply chain. The back end, in terms of end of life, that's a lagging effect. So of course, what you see is as the batteries go into circulation as vehicles, those vehicles have a useful life. There's all different metrics that are used. We typically use somewhere between 8 and 10 years as the average life of one of these vehicles. And then they come back out of the economy. So what we see today is predominantly on the EV side, the battery manufacturing scrap. But the other segment that has also come up, as you would expect with the OEMs, is things like manufacturing warranty replacements. And so, as there's, with any vehicle, if there's a problem, you take it back to the dealer fixes it. If it's a problem with the battery, then the battery comes to us for recycling.
Yeah. And I think, Tim, you've talked publicly about what Life Cycle sees as a tsunami of end-of-life batteries. And again, that's sort of 8 to 10 year lifespan. When do you think that's likely to sort of hit North America, given the exponential growth in the technology today?
Yeah, by the mid-2020s, we're expecting that market to be a significant portion. It's still likely at that point in time to be heavily dominated by battery manufacturing scrap. But if you think about it, if the scrap is somewhere in the range of 5 to 10, maybe 15% of that total battery manufacturing volume, well, by the time it's end of life, it's 100%. So it's sort of, it does definitely sort of build up in cadence to the point that you end up with basically a wall of batteries that start coming out of the market in the late 2020s.
Right, right. And then in terms of what the recycling or recovery activities will be, I mean, there was a time when, and maybe this is early days more than today, but there was certainly a time when we talked about a secondary market for batteries prior to recycling. So as battery storage, for example, given that a lot of the batteries are known to have a valuable, an energy valuable asset in them at maybe 80% of performance. So, I mean, there certainly was a push at one point for sort of reuse of EV batteries as opposed to the recycling of those batteries. I wonder how you at Life Cycle view the role of that kind of deployment in respect of end-of-life recycling.
Yeah, we see that reuse will definitely be part of the industry going forward. But one of the interesting things about this overall segment over the last decade is the cost of new batteries continues to come down. And we've seen that year-on-year reduction in terms of the cost of new batteries. And so the case for second life or batteries was much stronger when the cost of making a new battery was higher. Today, about 70% of the cost of making a new battery is in the materials that go into the battery. So this case for going into recycling becomes greater because that marginal saving, if you're already reducing the capacity of the battery by 20%, before you even then put in the cost of going through the, let's call it the remanufacturing process to make it useful for second life, then you're adding additional costs. So now you're approaching, in our view, likely exceeding that value of those materials that remain in the battery. So it's difficult to make the economic case for that. The other form is the fact that there's just so many different SKUs. There's so many different form factors of batteries in the market today. In the early EV days, there was talks of, would we actually standardize batteries within EVs, for example? That would make it much easier for a reuse case, but because every vehicle is going to have a different pack, and a lot of them are going to actually have different module designs, then, and now we're actually seeing beyond that, different cell designs, different chemistries and the like, it becomes very difficult to produce a standardized product from a end-of-life source, because there's a little bit of an unknown in terms of what's coming out of the market when exactly, and there's so much inconsistency between those different form factors that it becomes difficult even from a manufacturing perspective to actually come up with a standardized second life model. So with all these things combined, like I said, we still think it's going to be part of the industry, but we don't see it being a dominant part of the future industry.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I think it's fair to say that the one of the complaints within the EV battery industry early on was the variance in terms of the chemistries and the evolution of those chemistries in product cycles of 6, 12, 18 months. In other words, a moving target, of course, with a delay in respect to that end of life. And I wonder if you can talk about your technology as to how your technology manages all those variants as they arise from different producers as well as from different iterations of those battery cycles.
Yeah, when we designed the process, we deliberately designed it to take all form factors and all different types of lithium-ion based chemistries. And when I started in the industry, there was really only three. There was LFP, which is lithium iron phosphate, LCO, lithium, cobalt, and then you also had LMO, which is not a very typically used chemistry today. Today we have well over a dozen commercial chemistries on the market. And so in order to address that, we made sure that our spoke facilities were capable of handling all different form factors. It's largely a mechanical process to get it to the intermediate material where we've now separated out the active materials, so the anode and the cathode materials. And then on the back end, what our hub process does is it takes that material, and then we're basically breaking that material down, putting it back into solution. So we actually dissolve all these metals back into solution, and we recreate the precursor that goes into making the cathodes. So rather than trying to focus and design it for one specific chemistry, by doing that, it allows us to take a broad spectrum of chemistries into the process. So we actually, very confidently say that we can take any form factor, any chemistry into our process. And because you said the iteration between new chemistries now is getting shorter and shorter, 12, 16, 18 months, we're seeing new chemistries come out on a regular basis. We didn't also want to make a product that was going directly back into the battery, rather making a precursor. So we're talking about things like nickel sulfates, cobalt sulfates, lithium carbonate. They're the building blocks that go back into the batteries, and that way we're not left with the legacy of the historic chemistries. We're actually starting again with new building materials to make new cathode materials and new batteries.
Yeah, which I gather is a challenge in this sort of cathode to cathode recycling format, right? Where you really have to bet on a specific technology with a specific chemistry, right?
And being able to get that one form factor, which is the harder part as well.
Right, yeah. So in terms of opportunities for new manufacturing in batteries, are we seeing because of the availability of EV battery recycling in North America, are we seeing companies more interested in situating new EV battery manufacturing in North America, where the materials are now being sourced through a process like yours?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I would say that this is a trend that's happening all the way around the world at the moment. I would say they're still largely led by the customers in which they sell the batteries to, and being closely associated with them. But what we're seeing is the desire to have a closer partnership, but right from the battery manufacturing company, with the automotive company, with the recycler, to make sure that that loop is closed properly. We all know that there's going to be a shortage of these materials going into the future, and making sure that you don't lose them once they're in your supply chain is a very important point for some of these companies. But they're also looking for those sustainability metrics. They want to make sure that these materials are being treated properly. And so what's happening is they're being more and more selective. And I'll give you one example. We're seeing a move away from high temperature processing, which would involve burning off different components of the batteries because of that emissions profile, and coming back to that desire to fit into their ESG framework, as providing it fits within their cost framework, their economic framework, and then being able to supply those critical materials. Being able to cover those full three components is very important for them. And what we're doing is it's actually kind of the other way around. We're actually looking to locate our facilities with their facilities, not the other way around, because we have these low cost, easy to deploy spoke facilities. We can do that. And you'll see that over and over again.
Right. And when you mention ESG, I mean, I think your process is very, it's well positioned in terms of CO2 emissions, I think NOx and SOx emissions. And maybe you could talk about water use as well, because that's obviously another ESG concern.
Yeah, absolutely. So at both the spoke facilities and at our hub facilities, we're a zero liquid discharge process. So we recycle 100% of the solution back through the plant. We've also been able to significantly reduce the amount of water that we consume. So by comparison, for every ton of batteries that we process and produce the materials that go into them, by comparison to the mining industry, we offset about 97 tons of water. And so that's, a significant water saving associated with the recycled process. And part of that comes down to how Li-Cycle operates. I mean, that's always been one of our key pillars, is making sure that we have the best possible environmental footprint. But the technology itself also lends itself to be able to maximize that recycle. And so whilst everything's done in solution, in a water-based solution, it's recycled back through the plant. And that way you get the most benefit out of it.
Right. And I wonder if you could just touch on the the process itself, because as we might have alluded to earlier, it's not a thermal process. So, in understanding the technologies that are out there, as I understand it, your technology is really a leaching process, if we could use that vernacular, and it doesn't involve a thermal step, and that I think gives you some better performance in terms of resource recovery, but maybe it also allows you to recover certain kinds of batteries that otherwise don't lend themselves to a thermal process. Can you just talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So at our spoke facilities, it's a wet mechanical process. So this is where we basically break down the batteries and we separate out the battery materials into three key products. It's a low density plastic, a metallic foil product, which we sell as a copper and precious metal concentrate. But the key thing we're after there is what we call black mass concentrate. And black mass is just the anode and cathode materials from within the battery. So that process, because of its nature and how it's designed, is that can take all those different form factors. We're not burning off the electrolyte, we're not burning off the plastics or the binder as part of that process. It's purely mechanical, which is a big important step for the industry, because traditionally that would have been a thermal process where they're burning off those sorts of components to separate out the black mass. It also makes it better from a hygiene perspective because everything's kept in solution. We have no dust and no, very little noise and the like. So it's actually a very clean, elegant plant. On the hub side, and you touched on this in terms of from the leaching perspective, this is where we take the black mass from multiple spokes and we process that in a central location. And what we've done is we've adapted the hydrometallurgical framework that is used right across the mineral processing industry for things like copper, nickel, cobalt, and lithium. And we've basically developed a process whereby we take those metals and we dissolve them into solution. By comparison, traditionally that black mass material would have gone to a smelter and that would have burnt off the graphite. And it also would have, because lithium is such a light metal, it would typically deport to the slag, which is just the waste component of that high temperature process.
Right.
And so now you would basically end up with two intermediate products, that key one being what they call matte, which would be the copper, the nickel, and the cobalt. And that would then have to go off for hydrometallurgical refining as well. So they would do the same thing. Basically, they would try and dissolve those metals into solution and then separate them out in solution and produce the individual metals on the back end. For groups who do high temperature processing and want to recover the lithium, they would then take the slag component and try and do something similar to that. The difficulty with that is you've now complexed the lithium with iron and aluminum and things that are rather difficult to separate out. What we do is we take that metal materials from the black mass, we dissolve them directly into solution. If this was a geological resource, as engineers, this is how we would recommend processing it, because these materials are actually highly amenable to going directly into solution. You don't have to do that high temperature pre-treatment step. And in doing so, we save a whole lot of cost and complexity and everything else. But you also touched on it, because we do that, now we're not burning off the graphite, for example, so we can recover the graphite and we're able to sell that back into the industry. For lithium, for example, because we haven't now complexed the lithium with the iron and the aluminum, we're able to get higher recoveries of the lithium, we're able to produce higher grade products and the like. So what you end up with is a more fit for purpose process that targets all those critical materials. You end up with almost no solid waste. We're not emitting any wastewater. And because we're not high temperature processing, we don't end up with any meaningful amount of air emissions either. So it's just a very elegant way to approach the problem of processing these materials.
Right. And then in terms of your strategy, so we talked a bit about the hub and the spoke. So I think you made an announcement, well received in the industry, obviously, of another spoke. I think this is in Arizona, if I'm not mistaken. And I think your plan, as I've seen it publicly, is to have a single hub in North America with a number of spokes, maybe six or so, and then to also look at both the European and Asian markets for a similar type of hub and spoke alignment. Can you talk a bit more about where you see the opportunities in those two markets?
Yeah, absolutely. And so you're spot on. So in North America, we have the 3 spokes, with the one in Arizona under construction at the moment, with the hub in Rochester. The business model is 12 spokes feeding a single hub facility. The hub, you benefit from economies of scale, and therefore it makes sense to process those materials to produce the intermediate materials, reduce the weight locally, produce something that's easy to transport to a centralized location. As we look around the world, one of the benefits of lithium-ion batteries is they're essentially the same all over the world. The batteries that we use here in North America are not different to the batteries that we see in Europe or in China, for example. And so what we're doing now is starting to roll out our technology around the world in partnership in large with different groups in different regions. Over the next 5 years, we have 18 more spokes to build, including the one in Arizona. And that'll be spread out across North America, Europe, and Asia. Asia is an interesting model, particularly if we talk about our China strategy. In China, in particular, there is existing recycling companies, but one of the groups of batteries that they don't go for is what we call LFP batteries, or lithium iron phosphate batteries. These are batteries that we've most recently heard Tesla and Volkswagen talking about, but the reality is that this is one of the oldest chemistries that's been around. Why people like it is because it's a cheap chemistry. It doesn't contain the valuable nickel and cobalt. Well, the traditional recycling industry was really targeting the nickel and cobalt. And as a result, these LFP batteries have been largely left unchecked when it came to recycling. It would largely be processed to recover the copper from the anode foil within the battery, and then the rest of the material would be landfilled. What a lot of people don't understand is that, well, this market is actually somewhere between 20 and 30% of the Chinese market. So on a global context, that's a massive market in terms of lithium-ion batteries. With Li-Cycle's technology, because we're once again not going through this high temperature processing, we've actually developed a bespoke process for lithium-ion batteries. We can process those LFP batteries in an economic way to recover those components. And so once again, same sort of process that you see here in North America, and we're enabled to now process this economically and return those materials back to the industry. And so we see that as a key market opportunity going forward in the Asian market in particular.
Yeah, and I think that announcement from Tesla was fairly recent, and I think it obviously took a lot of people by surprise, in the sense that it is moving back to an earlier technology, but obviously one that is a cheaper technology and that does not rely upon the same amount of precious metals. And I guess when we're talking about the most challenging precious metals to source from the extractive industries, I think cobalt is often named as the most problematic, right? And to your knowledge, is that one of the values of your process, that you don't have to, there's not new cobalt introduced into the materials?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because we have that flexibility to deal with all the different types of chemistries, it's definitely an advantage. Cobalt today, most of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC. There's been documented and well established issues associated with cobalt production from the DRC in terms of human rights violations and the like. So you do have major automotive groups and battery groups which are trying to find alternative, more sustainable sources of cobalt. One of the benefits of recycling is that we can capture this material, return it back to the industry, and basically defer production from some of these more challenging locations where cobalt comes from. So it definitely has an important part of that industry and making sure that lithium-ion batteries remain sustainable going forward.
Yeah. I mean, that obviously has international implications that we continue to see play out. And let me ask you, when we talk about transportation, and we always talk about EV batteries, and of course, it's country cousin in my mind, which is electrification through fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cells. Do you have any thoughts as to how the EV battery space works with the fuel cell space in terms of this energy transition, perhaps focused on the sort of transportation sectors?
Yeah. Sorry. Yes, Jonathan.
Yes,
yeah,
please.
absolutely. So, it's a really interesting premise, and what we see is that both lithium ion and fuel cell technology actually work hand in hand. It's interesting that lithium ion, even in the transport sector, is displacing even some of the legacy technologies like lead acid batteries. So we're seeing a lot of OEMs now transition away from lead acid to lithium ion. There's always going to be a need for energy storage, regardless of whether or not it's hydrogen or otherwise. So even in vehicles, my personal view is that hydrogen lends itself best towards the long-range heavy-duty transport industry. They're ones that I think struggle the most in terms of being able to have a use case for lithium-ion batteries. And so you'll see the synergistics play out between those two industries there. I would say the other part of it is that more and more as we want to go to renewable production of hydrogen, you're going to see the need for renewable power and with renewable power storage. So there's all these sort of symbiotic relationships that exist. And I don't think that one dominates the other. It's just that you almost need lithium ion to make hydrogen viable. And I think hydrogen will have a position to play in the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And then in terms of applications, we've talked about the OEMs, the vehicle manufacturers, and I think the trucking industries, long range and short range. Have you been looking at all at other types of modes of mobility, whether it's air or marine? Have those applications have they been considered in terms of EV battery transitions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give you a great statement that comes from actually one of our directors, Anthony Say, and he calls it Lithium Z, which is all about the vertical orientation of lithium-ion batteries. Since their inception, we've really been moving them around to move things on the ground, but as we move towards air transportation and of course marine transportation comes in as one of these next generation applications, I really see that that's an area where solid-state batteries will be required and thrive in. Of course, with solid-state batteries, you get a higher energy density, which is very important for these components or these applications that require the overcoming of gravity, basically, to move them around. The lighter, the better, the more energy you need. One of the exciting things about that is that for the recycling of lithium-ion batteries, solid-state batteries actually provides a big opportunity. One of the least recyclable components of a lithium-ion battery is graphite, just because there's so many different types of graphite that we use, but also the physical nature of the graphite changes over the life of the battery. So we always talk about spherical graphite. It changes to different shapes over the course of the life of the battery, whereas when you have a solid-state battery, you have a metallic anode, which is more amenable to recycling and going back into a battery. So really sort of interesting applications that we see playing out with these next generation batteries.
Great, and I suspect you see this as we do. There is a push to decarbonize every industry, whether it's transportation, industry, buildings, you name it. Materials, obviously, consumer goods. So, I mean, it seems to me the growth potential for Li-Cycle and its partners is goes without saying. So I think with that, I would thank you very much, Tim, for your participation today. Great comments, really interesting stuff, and I think something for all of us to reflect on and what we see in our own industries and where we see our opportunities. So fabulous stuff, Tim. Thank you again.
Very much welcome, Jonathan, and thank you for your time.